The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and barbecue smoke, a familiar scent that signaled the end of another, ordinary day. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least pretended to, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. But for Patricia Moore, this sense of calm had been disrupted recently. Patricia lived in a modest two-story house on Maple Street, a street she proudly referred to as the heart of the community. She had called it home for over 20 years, raising her children there before they left for college and eventually started lives of their own. Now, with her kids gone and her husband passed away 5 years ago, Patricia spent most of her days tending to her garden, baking pies no one asked for, and keeping an eye on the neighborhood. To her, maintaining order was more than just a hobby. It was a duty. She liked things neat and tidy. Her mailbox stood perfectly straight, unlike Mr. Henderson's across the street, which leaned slightly to the left. Her rose bushes were pruned to perfection, while Mrs. Dawson's front yard often looked like it could use some work. And when it came to people, well, Patricia believed in certain standards. People should be polite, respectful, and, most importantly, fit in. Anything outside those boundaries made her uneasy. So when a moving truck pulled up in front of the vacant house next door one Saturday morning, Patricia felt a knot form in her stomach. She peeked out from behind her curtains, pretending to water her plants as she watched the activity unfold. The truck wasn't anything special, a plain white vehicle with the words "Quick Move" painted on its side, but something about it set off alarm bells in her mind. Who would move here? Why now? And why hadn't anyone mentioned it? Her curiosity turned into full-blown concern when the new neighbor stepped out of a sleek black sedan parked behind the truck. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed, in a tailored suit despite the casual nature of moving day. His skin was dark, his posture confident, and he carried himself with an air of authority that Patricia found unsettling. She didn't recognize him from any local events or gatherings, which only added to her unease. "Who does he think he is?" she muttered under her breath, gripping the watering can tighter than necessary. "This isn't Manhattan. You don't need to dress like you're running a Fortune 500 company." As the hours passed, Patricia continued to observe from the safety of her living room window. She noted how efficiently the man directed the movers, pointing out exactly where each piece of furniture should go. He seemed organized, almost military-like in his precision. A few times, delivery trucks arrived, unloading boxes labeled with logos she didn't recognize. One box caught her attention because it bore the insignia of a security company. What could he possibly need all that equipment for, she wondered. By late afternoon, the commotion had died down, and the movers drove away. The man stood on his porch, surveying the scene with what appeared to be satisfaction. That's when Patricia decided she needed answers. Grabbing a plate of cookies she'd baked earlier, though not specifically for him, she marched across the lawn, forcing a smile onto her face. "Hello," she called out cheerfully, though her tone lacked warmth. "Welcome to the neighborhood." The man turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said politely, though his voice carried a hint of reserve. "I'm Marcus Kelly." "Patricia Moore," she replied, thrusting the plate of cookies toward him. "I live right next door. If you ever need anything, sugar, milk, advice, don't hesitate to ask." Marcus accepted the plate with a nod. "Appreciate it," he said, though his eyes flickered briefly to the house behind her as if sizing it up. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Moore." Patricia lingered for a moment, searching for something else to say. "So, do you have family joining?" "You soon?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "No," Marcus replied evenly. "It's just me for now." "Oh," Patricia said, unable to hide her disappointment. She had hoped to learn more, perhaps discover that he had a wife or children who might balance out whatever strangeness she sensed. But instead, she was left with even more questions. "Well, I suppose it must get lonely living alone. Maybe we'll see you around at the community potlucks?" "We'll see," Marcus said, his tone neutral. He glanced at his watch. "Excuse me, but I've got a few things to finish up inside." Without waiting for a response, he stepped back into his house and closed the door firmly behind him. Patricia stood there for a moment, feeling both dismissed and frustrated. She returned to her own home, muttering under her breath about rude behavior and lack of neighborly spirit. Over the next few days, Patricia kept a close eye on Marcus. She noticed he came and went at odd hours, sometimes leaving in the middle of the night and returning early in the morning. His car, a sleek, expensive model, was always spotless, as if he took great pride in its appearance. Occasionally, she saw him talking to strangers who visited his house, men and women dressed in suits similar to his own. They never stayed long, and their visits always seemed hurried. Patricia's imagination began to run wild. What kind of person operated like that? Surely no one normal would act so secretive. Maybe he was involved in something illegal. Drug trafficking, perhaps, or money laundering. Or worse. The thought sent shivers down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Kelly was trouble, and the sooner she did something about it, the better. One evening, as she sat in her armchair flipping through channels on the TV, Patricia spotted Marcus unloading boxes from his trunk. Her heart raced. This was it. The evidence she needed. Whatever was in those boxes had to be suspicious. Without thinking twice, she grabbed her phone and dialed a number she rarely used. 911. When the operator answered, Patricia cleared her throat and spoke carefully, choosing her words with deliberate precision. "Hi, yes, I'd like to report a suspicious individual in my neighborhood," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "He's been acting strangely since he moved in. Late-night visitors, strange deliveries, and now he's bringing in boxes that look questionable." The operator asked for details, and Patricia described Marcus without explicitly mentioning his race. But her tone left little room for doubt. As she hung up the phone, a wave of satisfaction washed over her. Finally, someone would listen. Someone would investigate. And once they did, they'd see that she was right all along. Little did Patricia know her actions were about to set off a chain of events far beyond anything she could have anticipated. For Marcus Kelly wasn't just another resident of Maple Street. He was a man with secrets of his own, secrets that would turn Patricia's world upside down in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. The call to 911 left Patricia feeling a strange mix of relief and excitement. She had done her civic duty, or so she told herself. Now it was up to the authorities to handle the situation. Sitting in her living room, she peeked through the curtains, again, watching as Marcus continued unloading boxes from his car. He seemed completely unaware that trouble was on its way. The thought made Patricia smile smugly. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. 2 officers pulled up in a marked patrol car, their lights flashing silently in the quiet evening. Patricia watched eagerly as they stepped out, adjusting their hats and glancing at the house next door. She felt a surge of pride knowing that her instincts had been correct. Something about Marcus was off, and now everyone would see it. Marcus, however, didn't appear fazed when he noticed the officers approaching. In fact, he greeted them with a calmness that surprised even Patricia. She leaned closer to the window, straining to hear what they were saying. From her vantage point, she could only catch snippets of their conversation, but it was enough to make her blood boil. "Good evening, officers," Marcus said smoothly, extending a hand. "How can I assist you?" One of the officers hesitated before speaking. "We received a report about some suspicious activity here. Can you tell us what's going on?" "Of course," Marcus replied without missing a beat. He gestured toward the boxes still sitting in his driveway. "These are just some personal belongings I'm unpacking. I recently moved into the neighborhood and I've been getting settled." Patricia rolled her eyes. Personal belongings? That was clearly a lie. What kind of person needed so many boxes filled with personal belongings? She clenched her fists, frustrated that Marcus was spinning such an obvious fabrication. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of pressing him further, one of the officers asked, "Do you mind showing us some ID, sir?" Marcus nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a badge, a shiny, official-looking badge, and handed it over. Patricia's jaw dropped. A badge? What did that mean? The officers studied it carefully, their expressions shifting from suspicion to respect. One of them spoke into his radio, confirming something before turning back to Marcus. "Chief Kelly, we apologize for disturbing you. We weren't aware you'd relocated to this area." "Chief Kelly?" Patricia's heart sank. "Chief? As in, the chief of police?" No, that couldn't be right. There had to be some mistake. This man wasn't a law enforcement official. He was just a shady neighbor who didn't belong in her perfect little community. Marcus accepted the apology graciously, shaking hands with both officers before they returned to their car and drove away. Patricia stood frozen by the window, her mind racing. How could this have happened? She had been so sure of herself, so confident that she was doing the right thing. And now, not only had her plan backfired, but she had also embarrassed herself in front of someone who clearly held a position of authority. As the reality of the situation sunk in, Patricia grew angrier, not at herself, but at Marcus. Why hadn't he introduced himself properly when he first moved in? If she had known he was some high-ranking official, she never would have called the cops. It was his fault for being so secretive, for giving her reasons to suspect him in the first place. Determined to salvage the situation, Patricia decided to pay him another visit. This time she would play nice, pretend nothing had happened. After all, it wasn't uncommon for neighbors to misunderstand each other, especially during the early days of moving in. Maybe if she acted friendly enough, Marcus would forget about the whole incident. Patricia spent the rest of the night pacing her living room, replaying the events over and over in her head. She couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing on his porch, calm and collected, as the officers apologized to him. The word, chief, echoed in her mind like a taunt. Chief Kelly. It sounded so official, so powerful. How could she have been so wrong? But instead of admitting fault, Patricia convinced herself that Marcus had somehow tricked her. He must have known she was watching him, known she'd call the police. Maybe this was all part of some elaborate game he was playing. The next morning, Patricia decided it was time to smooth things over. She baked another batch of cookies, chocolate chip this time, and marched across the lawn with forced cheerfulness. When Marcus answered the door, he didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, there was a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes, as if he already knew why she was there. "Good morning, Mr. Kelly," Patricia said brightly, holding out the plate of cookies. "I just wanted to welcome you again. I hope we got off on the right foot yesterday." Marcus raised an eyebrow but accepted the plate. "Thank you, Mrs. Moore. That's very kind of you." "I feel terrible about last night," Patricia continued, forcing a laugh that sounded more nervous than friendly. "You know how it is when new people move in. Everyone gets curious and sometimes misunderstandings happen. I'm sure the officers explained everything." "They did," Marcus replied evenly. His tone was polite, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made Patricia uncomfortable. No harm done. Relieved that he seemed willing to let the matter drop, Patricia launched into small talk. She asked about his job, though she already knew the answer, and mentioned how much she loved living in the neighborhood. Marcus listened patiently, nodding occasionally, but his responses were brief and measured. It was clear he wasn't interested in becoming best friends. When the conversation ended, Patricia returned home feeling slightly better. At least Marcus hadn't called her out or made a scene. For now, things were under control. But deep down, Patricia's suspicions lingered. If anything, they grew stronger. Why had Marcus moved to such an ordinary neighborhood? Why did he need all those boxes and late-night visitors? And why did he always seem so unreadable? Over the following days, Patricia became obsessed with finding answers. She started keeping a notebook where she jotted down every detail about Marcus's comings and goings. On Monday, he left the house at 6:15 a.m. and returned at 7:45 p.m. On Tuesday, a delivery truck dropped off a package labeled classified. On Wednesday, Two men in suits visited for exactly 23 minutes. Patricia documented it all, convinced that if she gathered enough evidence, she'd uncover the truth. Her behavior didn't go unnoticed by the other neighbors. Emily Dawson, an elderly woman who lived across the street, noticed Patricia sneaking around Marcus's property one afternoon. Emily had always been fond of Patricia, despite her tendency to meddle, but this was different. Something about the way Patricia lurked behind bushes and snapped photos on her phone felt unsettling. "Patricia, dear, what are you doing?" Emily asked one day when she caught Patricia peering through her curtains. "Oh, nothing," Patricia replied quickly, lowering the binoculars she'd been using. "Just keeping an eye on things." Emily frowned. "Things? What kind of things?" Patricia hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, she sighed and gestured toward Marcus's house. "It's him, Emily. Something isn't right. I can feel it." Emily followed her gaze. "Marcus? He seems nice enough. A little quiet maybe, but harmless." "You don't understand," Patricia insisted. "He's hiding something. Late-night visitors, strange deliveries. It's all very suspicious, and then there's his job." "What about his job?" Emily asked. "He's the chief of police, or so he says. Do you really think someone like that would live here? In our neighborhood? It doesn't add up." Emily shook her head. "Patricia, you're jumping to conclusions. Just because someone keeps to themselves doesn't mean they're up to no good. Maybe he values his privacy. Have you ever thought of that?" Patricia bristled at the suggestion. "Privacy? Or secrecy? There's a difference, Emily." Emily sighed, knowing there was no point arguing. "Just be careful, okay? Accusing someone without proof can cause a lot of trouble, for both of you." But Patricia wasn't listening. Her mind was made up. Emily's words only fueled her determination to prove Marcus guilty of something, anything. Over the next few days, she redoubled her efforts, spending hours online researching FBI procedures, surveillance techniques, and even criminal profiles. She convinced herself that Marcus fit the bill perfectly. Secretive, disciplined, aloof, all signs pointed to wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Marcus began to notice Patricia's increasingly erratic behavior. At first, it was easy to dismiss her as overly curious or nosy, but when he spotted her taking pictures of his house from behind a tree, he realized this was more than mere curiosity. One evening, as he sat in his study reviewing case files, he pulled up a search engine and typed in Patricia Moore Maple Street. Within minutes, he found several social media posts where she complained about neighbors, local businesses, and even the city council. The pattern was clear. Patricia thrived on conflict, often blowing minor issues out of proportion. Marcus Kelly wasn't the kind of man to let things slide, especially when they involved someone poking around his personal life. He had spent years in law enforcement, dealing with people far more dangerous than Patricia Moore, but her behavior was starting to wear thin. While he didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, he also knew that ignoring it could lead to bigger problems down the line. So Marcus decided to take matters into his own hands, but not in the way Patricia expected. The first step was gathering information. Marcus reached out to a few trusted colleagues at the FBI and asked them to look into Patricia's background. It didn't take long for them to uncover a pattern. Patricia had a history of making complaints against neighbors, local businesses, and even strangers who happened to park in front of her house. Her grievances ranged from minor annoyances, like someone's mailbox being crooked, to wild accusations, including claims that a neighbor was running a dog-fighting ring, which turned out to be false. The reports painted a picture of a woman who craved control and used baseless accusations to assert herself. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus came up with a plan. He wasn't interested in punishing Patricia or dragging her through legal proceedings. Instead, he wanted to teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. With permission from his superiors, he organized a small-scale operation involving undercover agents. The goal was simple: make Patricia believe she had uncovered something serious, only to confront her with the truth later. The setup began on a Friday evening. Marcus invited several agents posing as friends and colleagues to his house under the guise of a casual get-together. They arrived in plain clothes, carrying duffel bags labeled classified and FBI property. Some parked their cars conspicuously in front of his driveway, while others entered through the back door to create the illusion of secrecy. Inside, they moved boxes around, spoke in hushed tones, and occasionally glanced out the window as if checking for surveillance. Patricia, predictably, was watching from her living room. She had been keeping tabs on Marcus ever since their awkward conversation earlier in the week, convinced that he was hiding something big. When she saw the unfamiliar faces and the ominous-looking bags, her heart raced. This was it, the proof she needed. Grabbing her phone, she snapped photos through the curtains and jotted down notes in her journal. By the time the agents left an hour later, Patricia was practically trembling with excitement. Unable to contain herself, she dialed 911 again. This time, her voice was louder, more urgent. "I'm calling about my neighbor," she said, struggling to keep calm. "He's definitely involved in something illegal. I saw him meeting with a group of men tonight. They were carrying suspicious equipment, and they kept looking around like they didn't want anyone to see them." The operator listened carefully before transferring the call to dispatch. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up outside Marcus's house. But these weren't ordinary officers. They were part of Marcus's team, briefed on the situation ahead of time. As they approached the door, Marcus opened it before they could knock, wearing a knowing smile. "Evening, Chief," one of the officers said, tipping his hat. "We got a report about some unusual activity here." Marcus nodded gravely. "Yes, I heard. Let me guess. It came from Mrs. Moore?" The officer hesitated, glancing back toward Patricia's house. "That's correct, sir." "Well, why don't we pay her a visit?" Marcus suggested, stepping outside. "I think it's time we cleared things up once and for all." Patricia watched in horror as the officers walked across her lawn. She hadn't expected them to come to her house. Not yet, anyway. Her hands trembled as she opened the door, forcing a nervous smile. "Officers, is everything okay?" One of the officers stepped forward, his expression stern. "Mrs. Moore, we need to talk to you about your recent calls to 911. Can we come in?" Patricia hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, leading them to her living room. Marcus followed behind, his presence adding to her growing unease. Once everyone was seated, the officer began speaking. "Mrs. Moore, you've reported suspicious activity involving your neighbor multiple times now. We've investigated each claim thoroughly, and so far we haven't found any evidence to support your allegations. However, repeated false reports can have serious consequences, including legal action." Patricia's face turned pale. "What do you mean, false reports? I know what I saw. Those men, the boxes, they're clearly hiding something." Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Moore, those men are federal agents. They were assisting me with routine work related to my position. Nothing illegal occurred." But, Patricia stammered, her confidence crumbling. "Why would you bring classified materials to a residential neighborhood? That doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense if you understand the nature of my job," Marcus replied. "But regardless, your continued harassment is unacceptable. If this behavior persists, we may need to take further action." The officers exchanged glances, silently agreeing to give Patricia a moment to process what she'd just heard. One of them handed her a pamphlet on responsible reporting and reminded her of the importance of verifying facts before contacting emergency services. Then, without another word, they stood up and left, leaving Patricia alone with Marcus. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Patricia stared at the floor, too embarrassed to meet his gaze. Finally, she whispered, I thought I was helping." "You weren't," Marcus said bluntly. "What you did was reckless and unfair. You judged me based on assumptions, not facts. And in doing so, you wasted valuable resources that could have been used elsewhere." Patricia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she knew deep down that he was right. The weight of her actions crashed over her, leaving her feeling smaller than ever before. When Marcus finally left, Patricia collapsed onto her couch, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. For the first time in years, she questioned whether her efforts to maintain order in the neighborhood had done more harm than good. And as she sat there in silence, she realized that repairing the damage she'd caused would require more than just apologies. It would take real change. The days that followed were some of the hardest Patricia had ever faced. She avoided leaving her house, too embarrassed to face her neighbors or even step outside. Every time she heard a car drive by or saw someone walking past her window, she imagined they were talking about her, the nosy woman who accused the FBI chief of being a criminal. The thought made her cheeks burn with shame. At first, Patricia tried to convince herself that Marcus and the officers had overreacted. After all, she was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. But as the hours passed and the weight of her actions settled in, it became harder to ignore the truth. Her assumptions about Marcus hadn't been based on facts. They'd been driven by fear and prejudice. And now, because of her behavior, she had alienated herself from everyone around. One afternoon, Emily Dawson stopped by with a basket of fresh muffins. Patricia hesitated before opening the door, unsure if she could handle another lecture. But Emily didn't come to scold her. Instead, she offered a kind smile and handed over the basket. "I thought you might need these," Emily said softly. "Things have been tough lately, haven't they?" Patricia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what I was thinking, Emily. I messed everything up." Emily stepped inside and sat down at the kitchen table. "We all make mistakes, dear. What matters is how we fix them." "But how do I fix this?" Patricia asked, her voice trembling. "Everyone must hate me. Marcus probably thinks I'm crazy." "He doesn't hate you," Emily replied gently. "And neither does anyone else. People understand that you were acting out of concern, even if it wasn't handled the right way. If you want to make things better, start by apologizing, not just to Marcus, but to yourself too." Patricia frowned. "To myself?" "Yes," Emily explained. "You've spent so much time worrying about what others think that you've forgotten to reflect on your own actions. Ask yourself why you felt the need to accuse Marcus in the first place. Was it really about safety, or was it something deeper?" Those words stayed with Patricia long after Emily left. That night, she sat alone, in her living room, staring at the notebook where she had documented every detail of Marcus's life. For weeks, she had convinced herself that she was protecting the neighborhood, but deep down she knew the truth. Her actions weren't about safety, they were about control. She had judged Marcus before giving him a chance, assuming he didn't belong simply because he was different. The next morning, Patricia decided it was time to take responsibility for her mistakes. She baked another batch of cookies, this time without ulterior motives, and walked across the lawn to Marcus's house. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the door, half expecting him to turn her away. But when Marcus opened it, his expression was neutral, neither warm nor hostile. "Mrs. Moore," he said, raising an eyebrow. "What can I do for you?" Patricia swallowed hard and held out the plate of cookies. "I wanted to apologize," she began, her voice shaky. "For everything. I was wrong to accuse you of anything. I let my fears get the best of me, and I hurt people in the process, including you." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Apology accepted," he said. "But I hope you understand that trust takes time to rebuild. It's not enough to say sorry. You have to show that you've changed." "I know," Patricia admitted. "And I will. I promise." Marcus accepted the cookies and thanked her politely, but there was still a distance between them, a reminder that forgiveness wouldn't come easily. Patricia returned home feeling both relieved and humbled. She knew repairing her relationships with Marcus and the rest of the neighborhood would be a long journey, but she was ready to try. Over the following weeks, Patricia worked hard to change her ways. She stopped spying on her neighbors and put away the notebook she had used to document their activities. Instead, she focused on small acts of kindness, delivering homemade meals to elderly residents, organizing a community cleanup day, and even hosting a potluck dinner to bring everyone together. At first, the turnout for the potluck was modest. Only a handful of neighbors showed up, including Emily, who encouraged Patricia to keep going. Slowly but surely, more people began attending, drawn by the genuine effort Patricia was making to reconnect. Even Marcus joined one evening, bringing a tray of store-bought brownies and chatting casually with the other guests. Though he remained reserved, his presence signaled a willingness to give Patricia another chance. As the months passed, the neighborhood started to feel like a community again. Conversations flowed more freely, and laughter echoed through the streets once more. Patricia found herself enjoying the simple pleasures of life, sharing stories with Emily, admiring the flowers blooming in her garden, and waving to passers-by, without suspicion lingering in her mind. Still, Patricia couldn't forget the lessons she had learned. She often thought about the harm her actions had caused and reminded herself to approach situations with empathy rather than judgment. Change wasn't easy, and old habits sometimes crept back in, but she worked hard to stay mindful of her behavior. One sunny afternoon. As Patricia sat on her porch sipping lemonade, Marcus walked by with his dog, a golden retriever named Max. He paused briefly and gave her a nod. "How are you doing, Mrs. Moore?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. "I'm doing okay," Patricia replied with a small smile. "Thank you for asking." Max wagged his tail and Marcus chuckled. "He likes you. Maybe we'll see you at the park sometime." Patricia watched as they continued down the street, feeling a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years. Things weren't perfect, and scars from the past still lingered, but progress had been made. For the first time in a long time, Patricia felt like she belonged, not because she controlled the neighborhood, but because she was part of it.